The company's image took another hit yesterday when the U.S. unsealed 2 new indictments against the company and its CFO, Meng Wanzhou. The indictments include allegations of stealing trade secrets, bank fraud, and obstruction of justice. What impact could those indictments have on Canada's review of Huawei and 5G? Should the allegations influence the federal government's decision? Robert Williams is Executive Director of the Tsai China Center at the Yale Law School. He joins me now from New Haven, Connecticut. Hi, Mr. Williams. Great to see you. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.
How should we interpret the 2 indictments that were unsealed yesterday? What do they tell us about Huawei, and what do they not tell us?
Well, what they do not tell us is related to the broader background concerns that the United States has about Huawei as a potential national security threat. And that's a concern that is longstanding and has more to do with the role of the Chinese government and its relationship with the company, and a concern that Huawei cannot truly be independent from the Chinese government. The indictments that were unveiled yesterday deal specifically with alleged offenses related to sanctions violations and theft of intellectual property from a U.S. business partner, which is corporate malfeasance to be sure, but is not something that should be conflated with that broader national security concern.
Do you think that the 2 will be conflated? I mean, given that the scrutiny over the national security side of this has been so high as of late, do you think, sort of outside of experts, that it will be conflated, and what might the detrimental effects of that be?
Sure, I think perceptions are naturally going to lead in that direction. And it's certainly the case that some of the broader concerns around Huawei and other Chinese entities, to be fair, have informed the Justice Department's decision to prioritize its so-called China Initiative, which is directed at a range of what the Justice Department sees as misbehavior and illegal activity on the part of Chinese individuals and entities in the United States. So prioritizing law enforcement resources is one thing, and then bringing these specific charges on these specific allegations is another. But as you say, perceptions are going to be what they are.
And just on that, China, of course, has been steadfast in its opinion, of the Chinese government, that the legal case against Huawei's CFO, Meng Wanzhou, is political in nature. Does yesterday's announcement change anything with that? Does it reinforce it? Does it pour cold water on it?
I'm sure for the Chinese leadership, it's going to confirm and reinforce that sense. However, I would just reinforce that if we look at the specifics of what is alleged here, we are talking about some fairly systematic and egregious behavior. Now, of course, none of this has been proven, but if we just go by the indictments themselves, I think there's very little question that this is a legitimate law enforcement action, just looking at the letter of the law.
And can I ask you to expand on that a little bit? What gives you... I mean, I know, for example, that the allegations date back a number of years, that they're about stealing sort of intellectual property, allegedly, as well as violating sanctions against Iran, lying to banks, that kind of thing. What makes you, when you, on the face of it, understand that this is not necessarily political in nature?
Well, in order to bring a charge like this, a grand jury has to reach a finding, and that is based on some evidence. So they have to present, prosecutors have to present a certain amount of evidence just to bring charges like this. That does not mean that these allegations are proven by any means. It does not mean that there won't be additional evidence that may contravene certain aspects of what the Justice Department has presented. We simply don't yet know enough detail to make an informed judgment about this, and that will be left to the justice system, as it well should be.
Is it possible, Mr. Williams, to view these proceedings, these criminal proceedings, as separate from the overall trade tensions between the two countries, or are they linked in some way?
Well, we have to remember, stepping back and looking at these indictments in context, that these criminal investigations began long before the current round of trade negotiations. So I don't think that we can look at the indictments as being linked to the trade tensions in a kind of transactional manner that some might be inclined to see them in. On the contrary, again, these may reflect long-standing concerns on the part of the Justice Department and law enforcement authorities, but I would be very reluctant to suggest that they are directly tied to the current trade negotiations. That's simply not the way the U.S. Justice Department tends to work.
And I know that you of course, explained how it's separate from the national security concerns, but it's happening against the backdrop, I guess, of those concerns being discussed, especially here in Canada. This country is reviewing Huawei's participation in our 5G network. If the West sort of en masse does freeze Huawei out of this emerging market, how do you think China will respond?
It's difficult to say. China's ambassador to Canada, for example, I understand has invoked self-defense in referring to some of the actions that have already been taken in the context of the arrest of Huawei's chief financial officer. So it's certainly the case that we can assume some action will be taken, some effort to advance the country's interests, but it's very difficult to speculate about what that will look like, how far it will go, and how much of the current, you referred earlier to the trade negotiations, how many of the current issues that are on the table there, which involve structural issues relating to the role of the Chinese government and the Chinese economy, how many of those issues will be affected and informed by this perception on the part of the Chinese leadership that there's a broad-based effort to thwart the interests of China and Chinese companies. It's very difficult to say, and I think we're likely headed for a rocky period.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your time and insight, Mr. Williams.
Thank you for having me.